you had your choice of other forms of philosophy entertainment today. So very much appreciate you coming here. It's a shame that this has to be virtual. I've spent a lot of time in Bristol, especially when I was a grad student for various reasons, and I have nothing but the fondest memories. So it would have been lovely to do this in person, and let's hope we can actually do so in the not too distant future. Great. So much by way of sort of gentle introduction. Let's launch into this. Just want to double check that you can that you can see the slides change. Is that okay? Excellent. All right. Good. Now, imagine you are a philosophy and physics undergraduate student, like I wasn't. And imagine that you were a particularly conscientious student and you choose to go to most, if not all, of the lectures, like I didn't. And imagine then, in the morning, you go to a metaphysics lecture. And at the metaphysics lecture, you're introduced to this idea of presentism, according to which the only things that exist are the things that exist now, roughly speaking. And you think, okay, well, that's an intuitively plausible suggestion. What are the sorts of presuppositions that have gone into establishing the plausibility of a claim like that? And you might think, oops, sorry, that was a bit of a mistake. And you might think, well, you'd have to have some notion of what it is for a time to be now. And so in particular, you'd need a notion of absolute simultaneity, you would think. And you say, okay, well, I can make my peace with that. But then, being the conscientious student you are, you go to the physics lecture in the afternoon, and you're taught about special relativity, where that's figuratively beaten out of you, or if you went to school like I did in India, literally beaten out of you. And you're then left with a little bit of a problem, because it seems as if there's a proposition that's endorsed by presentism of the form something like there is an observer-independent relation of absolute simultaneity. And it seems as if special relativity directly contradicts this proposition, right? In other words, it endorses the negation of that proposition. And you would think, okay, well, this is a bit of a problem. What should I do? In particular, you can ask the question, which discipline should triumph? And well, they say you should read the room, you should know your audience. I'm giving this talk at Bristol, so obviously the answer is the scientific one, and that's the end of the talk. Thanks for listening. Now imagine that the audience wasn't quite so sympathetic, right? And you actually wanted to give something like an argument for this position, the position that science should triumph. What sort of thing could you bring to bear? And you might actually be disappointed to discover that there aren't that many sharp articulations of arguments for this position, this sort of science first position. But there are lots and lots and lots of intuitively compelling arguments, or at least intuitively compelling pictures. So here's an example of one. This is the only longest chunk of text that I'm going to have in this talk. This is sort of extracted from an argument from David Lewis in the context of philosophy of maths, but I think it generalizes very nicely to science, where basically he says something like, look, science is a proper established discipline. Philosophy, on the other hand, is as shaky as can be. Would you like the job of telling scientists they must change their ways? If they challenge your credentials, will you boast of philosophy's other great discoveries? That motion is impossible, that time is unreal, that it is a wide open scientific question whether anyone has believed anything, and so on and on and on, ad nauseum? Not me. And as with many of David Lewis's arguments, and in particular many of David Lewis's sort of rhetorical flourishes, there is a good argument to distill from that rhetorical flourish. And I think roughly it's something like the following. We should believe a proposition that's endorsed by science over a competing proposition that's endorsed by philosophy, or more generally, some kind of robust non-scientific discipline, because of science's track record of success. Success with respect to what? Well, we'll come to that. And the track record is just, or the track record observation is just something like recent science has been successful, whereas time and again philosophy has failed with respect to a particular goal. Again, I'll spell that out as the talk progresses. And so let's give this position a name. Let's call this position deferential naturalism. Naturalism because of what it says about how we should think about science and philosophy. Deferential because the idea is we defer to science when it makes a claim that's in opposition to some non-scientific discipline. And I think the idea of looking for some kind of sharp articulation of an argument in favor of this sort of position is sort of along the lines of looking for a sharp articulation of an argument for something like induction. I mean, induction is intuitively plausible, but then it gets extremely fiddly when you actually try to give some kind of knockdown argument for why it's rational to believe in something like induction. I mean, there are plenty, and there are plenty that I find convincing, but I think we should think of deferential naturalism as requiring justifications along those lines. So let's sharpen the claim. So this is the claim that I want to defend in this talk. If science endorses P, and some non-scientific discipline or non-science endorses not P, then an agent should believe P over not P. Perfectly straightforward. Applied to the worry about presentism and special relativity, the idea is just insofar as special relativity is scientific, we should believe the claim that special relativity makes over the claim that presentism makes. Now, there's been a little bit of recent pushback against this position. In a paper that Alex Pazzo was kind enough to share with me pre-publication, he basically canvasses a few arguments, a few ways in which you can actually spell out an argument for deferential naturalism, and finds fault with them. And basically, the upshot of that paper is something like, well, we don't really have great arguments for deferential naturalism. So how is this inference, in particular, the inference from something like a track record argument to deferential naturalism, supposed to work? So that's, I think, the central concern, and that's going to be the central concern of my talk today. But there was also a paper in Field Studies from about 10 years ago where Daly and Liggins make a number of points. But one of the points they make is, when we talk about standards of comparison, when we talk about success, we need to establish a good place to look for appropriate standards of comparison. And the question is, where do those standards come from? And finally, there's a paper by Gideon Rosen. It's actually a review of a book by Penn Maddy, where he says, look, why should we take evidence of the success of something? Again, I should say this is in the context of mathematics, but it can be extended to science. Why should we take evidence for the success of science to translate to evidence for the truth of the sorts of claims that you want to defer to science with respect to? I noticed that I've just said recent pushback and then mentioned a couple of papers that are 10 and 20 years old. I guess it's recent on sort of, let's say, geological timescales. Let me rename these so that I kind of divorce them from the sort of their parent paper. So let's call the first problem the inference problem. Let's call the second problem the parity problem, and reformulate it slightly. Just say, with respect to a particular epistemic goal, we can say that science trumps non-science, but why should we choose that goal over any other? And let's call Rosen's problem, as he himself calls it, the authority problem. Right. So that sort of establishes what I want to address in this talk, but I just need to sharpen a little bit the characterization of deferential naturalism before we continue. In particular, I want to sharpen what I mean by science endorses P, and what I mean by an agent should believe P. So let's look at science endorses. You might think, well, is science even the sort of thing that can endorse a proposition? I mean, I imagine you'd need an agent to endorse a proposition, but I'm using endorse in a much broader sense. I just mean something like, if science endorses P, then P follows from some core tenets of a particular science via some acceptable process of inference. Now, this is really general, and really, in order to sharpen this, you'd have to say something about what acceptable processes of inference are. You'd also have to say something about what core scientific tenets are. But there are lots of proposals on the table for these sorts of things. So just choose the one that you like the best. And the strength of your deferential naturalism is going to depend on on which of these ways of spelling things out you choose. And similarly, you can do the same thing to understand what it means to say that non-science endorses P. Good. What about should believe? Well, the claim is, anytime I say something like, you should believe something, I'm trying to spell out some kind of normative force associated with a particular claim. The question is, how should we cash that out? And so in this talk, what I want to do is suggest that we can use epistemic utility theory to cash out the normative force of deferential naturalism. And the way that I want to do it is I want to argue that deferential naturalism acts as a constraint on epistemic rationality in such a way that it turns out to be irrational to violate deferential naturalism. So that's the broad picture. But you could ask the question, how is epistemic utility theory the sort of thing that can make this argument, that can sort of spell out the normative force? And I think the way to see that is to appeal to a sort of three-stage understanding of epistemic utility theory. This is as actually most of the stuff that I'm going to say about epistemic utility theory. This is shamelessly lifted from work by Richard Pettigrew. So in a paper from about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, Richard says, look, there are three stages to an epistemic utility justification of a particular norm. You have a descriptive stage where you mathematically model an agent's epistemic states. You've got a normative stage where you formulate particular norms, some fundamental norms, some less fundamental norms, in the appropriate terms that are given by whatever you've suggested in the at the descriptive stage. And then you have a justificatory stage. So you derive a particular norm that you're looking for, in particular a norm that you've specifically identified at the normative stage, from the other more fundamental norms that you've also identified at the normative stage. And so a simple way to put this is we're playing a game where we want to construct a sound argument whose conclusions are the required rationality norm, or whose conclusion is the required rationality norm, and whose premises are more fundamental and plausibly true premises or norms or whatever else. So that's basically what I wanted to say by way of setup. So let me briefly summarize the setup and then get into the actual meat of the talk. So we have here what I think is a pretty intuitively appealing claim, deferential naturalism, and also what I think is an intuitively appealing justification, the track record argument, which is a sort of meta-inductive justification. I identified three problems: the inference, the parity, and the authority problems. And then I suggested that we can sharpen the argument by casting everything in terms of epistemic utility theory. And in doing so, it turns out that deferential naturalism, at least this is what I'll argue, is a norm on epistemic rationality. And what we want to do is derive that as the conclusion of a sound argument. That's the game. So going forward, the plan is pretty straightforward. There are three sections. I'm going to introduce you to the absolute bare minimum that you need in order to the bare minimum of epistemic utility theory you need in order to understand what I'm talking about. I'll then use that to set up a toy model to just express how this kind of justification might work. And what I'm going to do is come up with a valid argument for what will actually turn out to be quite a terrible norm. What I'm then going to do is try in section B to give you a better argument. So to take that valid argument and turn it into a sound argument by weakening some of its premises, and turn that into a sound argument for deferential naturalism. In doing that, we're going to solve the inference problem. And then in the last section, which is not particularly long, I'm going to demonstrate how we can use this to solve the parity and the authority problems as well. So let's talk a little bit about epistemic utility theory. Now, epistemic utility theory takes its cues from decision theory, at least insofar as it talks about things like rationality, which is really the central feature. Now, decision theory is something that you use in order to model things like agents' behaviors and agents' preference profiles, and then come up with various sorts of norms on rationality. And epistemic utility theory does the same thing, except that instead of worrying about acts and utility and rationality to do with behavior, we worry about things like epistemic states and things like epistemic utility and epistemic rationality. But insofar as there's a nice kind of bijection across a lot of the structures, we can inherit a lot of the useful work that's already been done in decision theory in order to argue for particular claims with respect to epistemic rationality. So with that out of the way, let me briefly give you a little bit of the technical setup. This is very, very, very much the sort of technical setup you'd use for any kind of probabilistic anytime you're talking about any kind of probabilistic theory. We start off with W, which is just a set of possible worlds about which an agent has an opinion. So we have something like an agent. This is the agent whose opinions we care about, and this agent has opinions about some set of possible worlds. It doesn't really matter what that set is. Generally, you'd like it to be the case that it's as large a set as well, I don't want to say as possible. You'd like to think it's a pretty large set. What you then do is you want to generate a set of propositions about those worlds about which the agent has an opinion. And so what you do is you introduce what's known as a sigma algebra. I'm not going to define a sigma algebra. It's just a structure that you can impose on a set of worlds. And when you do that, it just generates a bunch of propositions. And in particular, it'll generate a bunch of propositions about those worlds. And therefore, it'll be a bunch of propositions about which the agent has some opinions. So let's call that an opinion set. And now what we can do is we can define a set of belief functions over that set of propositions. If those belief functions are probabilistic, we generally refer to them as credences. I'm going to assume probabilism, but I'm going to continue to say belief functions through the rest of the talk. And technically what's going on is you're just assigning a degree of belief between 0 and 1. It's in the closed interval, so it'll include 0 or 1, associated with each proposition in an opinion set. That's the setup. It's almost exactly, formally it is exactly the same as a setup for probability. Let's focus on one particularly important kind of belief function. Let's call it the omniscient belief function. And that's a belief function that looks at each possible world. So it's indexed to a particular possible world. It looks at each possible world and assigns the omniscient credence to every proposition in that world. By omniscient credence, I just mean it assigns a 0 to all the false propositions and assigns a 1 to all the true propositions in that world. So now, equipped with this technical baggage, we can make the claim that some belief functions are more rational to adopt than others. And when we say that, we immediately have the question, well, which ones? I mean, it's all very well to say some are more rational than others. We want to be able to identify which ones are the most rational. And in order to do that, we need to introduce a little bit more. We, in particular, need to introduce this notion of epistemic utility, which is something I briefly alluded to at the beginning. But basically, the idea behind epistemic utility is an agent is going to value particular belief functions a certain amount, and that amount is going to be codified in the inner choice of epistemic utility. So I should point out that the source of value is irrelevant. You might think that the most valuable belief functions are the belief functions that are, things like the omniscient belief function, or the ones that are closest to true to the omniscient belief function. But you can actually choose whatever you like. It might turn out that some truths are more valuable to you than other truths, and so you just weight them differently. And epistemic utility theory is sort of broad enough to incorporate all of that. So it's important to realize that the source of value is irrelevant. So just saying that I'm going to use epistemic utility theory is not enough to justify a particular claim about what the source of that utility is. Formally speaking, it's just going to take as an input a belief function and a possible world, and it's going to output some real number, or plus or minus infinity. That's what the bar over the R is. With that, we can now define something that might actually be quite useful, which is the notion of a truth-directed utility function. And so now we say, look, no, our source of epistemic value or epistemic utility is truth. And so therefore, we're going to gerrymander our choice of utility functions such that the utility associated with belief functions that are closer to the truth is higher than the utility associated with belief functions that are further away from the truth. Perfectly intuitive, perfectly straightforward. But now we've introduced a new idea, which is this idea of closeness to truth. So now we can ask the question, how are we going to cache that out? And the answer is, well, these belief functions have as the codomain a subset of the real numbers, and that has some very nice and useful metric structure. So let's just inherit the metric structure sort of pointwise, as it were. We do this, all the time. And so here's a suggestion. The suggestion is we can use a squared Euclidean distance. We can define a squared Euclidean distance between two belief functions with respect to a particular opinion set. And the way that you do that is you just look at the difference between the beliefs that are assigned. You take their absolute value and you square it, and then you just sum that over all the propositions in your opinion set. And so now this allows us to suggest what I think is a particularly plausible norm, which is if our goal is truth, we should adopt a truth-directed utility function. And so let's call this the truth-directedness norm. So that takes care of one of our premises. Let's now figure out how we're going to characterize rationality. And the standard way in which you do that is by appealing to what are known as dominance norms. So here's a weak dominance norm. And remember that dominance norms are associated with particular belief functions with respect to particular utility functions. So we've already established what kind of utility function we want to use. And so we can talk about weak dominance of one belief function by another, just if the utility associated with, say, belief function B is higher than B prime in at least some worlds, and it's no lower than B prime in all worlds. If that's the case, then we say that B weakly dominates B prime. And so here's a suggestion. If we're interested in truth, we use a truth-directed utility function, and then we can cash out irrationality in terms of a violation of weak dominance, the appropriate weak dominance stipulation. And so let's call that a weak dominance norm. I'm not being particularly creative with my choice of terminology here. Finally, let's look at a norm that we can plausibly derive, and this is a terrible norm. It's a really it's sort of unhelpfully strict, but really this is the game that I'm just trying to play is to show you how we can use epistemic utility theory. So supposing I want to derive a norm that I'm going to call the irrationality of non-omniscience. According to this norm, for any opinion set, it's irrational to adopt any belief function other than the omniscient belief function. And so basically any belief function that we could plausibly have is going to turn out to be irrational. And the strategy using epistemic utility theory is to derive it from more fundamental norms, in particular the fundamental norms that I just described to you. So let's have a look at what an argument for IN might look like. We start off by establishing what our source of epistemic value is. So let's just say it's truth. We then invoke the truth directedness norm and the weak dominance norm. And then we invoke something that actually just follows straightforwardly from a definition. So it's a really simple theorem, which I'll call the dominance of omniscience, which is for any opinion set, the omniscient function will always weakly dominate every other belief function. This just follows from the definition of of all the terms in there. And from that, you can conclude this is a valid argument. You can conclude IN. Now, of course, we don't want to believe that IN is true, and so really what we want to do is argue that one or more of those norms of those premises is untrue, is false. And in fact, I'd like to argue actually that all four of them are the first three are false. The fourth is just a definition. And so this is what I'm going to do to try to arrive at an argument for deferential naturalism. But what we can do is we can distill a template, and the template is identify the source of value, then identify the appropriate utility function that's directed towards that source of value. Identify a dominance norm. Recall that in order to write down a dominance norm, I need a utility function. So use the utility function that I got from the second step and identify a dominance norm. And then either prove a theorem or provide some kind of robust argument that says, here's a class of belief functions that I can identify in every possible world. Here's a competing class of belief functions. This class of belief functions dominates this class of belief functions. If that's the case, then it's irrational to accept this set of belief functions, and we're done. That's the formal setup, and that brings me to the end of section A. So now let's do something actually useful. Let's talk about how we might go about solving the inference problem. Seems not to be. Oh no, it's fine. Sorry. Right. So in terms of the template. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go back there. In terms of the template, this was the argument that we had for IN, for the irrationality of non-omniscience. Let's do the same thing for deferential naturalism, and we'll see that we actually have to change all four of the suggestions, and that's what I'm going to do in this section. So what happens is the template gives rise to this plausibly sound argument for deferential naturalism. I've introduced a whole bunch of new terms here, and I've also introduced obviously a whole bunch of new premises, and I don't really have the time to justify all of them. What I'm going to do is spend a little time justifying the third premise and most of my time justifying the fourth, because I think that's the sort of original contribution that I have to this discussion. And I'm just going to invoke arguments that are already in the literature to justify premises 1 and 2, in particular arguments from people like Goldman and Pettigrew. So I'm not going to really justify those premises, but I am going to talk about what those premises mean, in particular what the words in those premises mean. So I've introduced this notion of accuracy. I've also introduced a bunch of other things. I should say that I'm going to tell you what all of those words mean apart from immodesty. The reason is really I'm just constrained for time. So you can treat the word immodestly as just a qualifier. It's just going to sort of reduce the space of acceptable belief functions. But that's all I'm going to say about that. But let's start with the first premise. So Veritism is the claim that the only source of epistemic value is accuracy. Contrast that with what we had in the previous section, which I called elitism, which said that the only source of epistemic value was truth. Now, I think that's too strong. I think we should not be, such elitist snobs as to scoff at anything other than absolute truth. Accuracy is the suggestion for the source of epistemic value that's put forth by people like Pettigrew, and accuracy is just cashed out as well. Accuracy is just understood as quantifying how close a belief function in a particular world is to the omniscient function at that world. And so we can actually straightforwardly measure this because we've got an idea of closeness of belief functions, right? I introduced that in the last section via this notion of the Euclidean squared distance. And so that can characterize our inaccuracy because whereas in the previous section I introduced you to the distance between two belief functions, we can now take if we take one of those belief functions to be the omniscient belief function, the inaccuracy of a particular belief function is just its distance from the omniscient belief function. But now if we're Veritists, then we've also made a claim, a substantive claim about epistemic utility. And so we can actually just use the Euclidean squared distance, not just as a measure of inaccuracy, but directly as a measure of epistemic utility. The more accurate a belief function is, the more epistemically useful it is to us, or epistemically valuable it is to us. When we do that, what we're invoking is sometimes known as the Breer accuracy or inaccuracy. I'm going to use accuracy and inaccuracy interchangeably because, you know, in order to turn an accuracy into an inaccuracy, you just have to sort of multiply by a minus. Good. So that hopefully that's sufficiently straightforward. We've got an idea of what accuracy is. I've also given you an idea, hopefully, of what the second premise is talking about. So now let's talk about the third premise, the dominance norm. So Breer dominance is just a special case of accuracy dominance, which is just a special case of the kind of dominance that we've already encountered. It's just dominance with respect to the Breer accuracy or inaccuracy score. More specifically, the idea is if I've got a belief function B and I've got a belief function B prime, then B will Breer dominate B prime if it's closer to the omniscient function with respect to the Euclidean square distance in every single possible world. So it's a claim about all possible worlds. This, that's hardly surprising. All dominance claims are claims about all possible worlds or all relevant possible worlds. And you can, of course, just justify this Breer dominance norm by invoking the arguments for veritism that I told you exist, but didn't really say much about.
Sorry, Tushar, is there anything to significance to the fact that this is the strong version of dominance rather than the weak? Is that important? Could we weaken this? Does that matter?
For the purposes of this talk, it's not important because I'm really going to treat all dominance norms as sort of, what I'm trying to give you is a template, and I just want to say, look, here's a plausible dominance norm. As it happens, this speaks to the immodestly part of the Breer dominance. You want it to be a version of strong dominance. You actually want it to be slightly stronger than even strong dominance. But for sort of dialectical reasons, I chose not to get bogged down in that. But thanks for that, Kareem. But the justification proceeds via similar lines. The justification for immodest Breer dominance is whatever justification I'm giving you for this dominance principle, plus a couple of other things that again Pettigrew argues for extremely convincingly in the first chapter of his book. Good. I knew I was going to get called up on that. I just knew it. Anyway, so those are the first three premises, and hopefully that's at least sort of vaguely plausible. The thing that I really want to spend some time talking about is the fourth premise, which is what I call the track record premise. According to the track record premise, a particular set of belief functions in each possible world, which I've called TR belief functions, is going to immodestly Breer dominate the set of non-TR belief functions. So the question is, well, what do I mean by TR belief functions? And the answer is, well, let's start a little bit further back than where I was about to. So let's start with a particular opinion set, but it's a very, very specific opinion set. It's an opinion set that consists of propositions that are such that either the proposition P or its negation is endorsed by the discipline with the best track record concerning truths in the opinion set. And also, if it's the case that P is endorsed by the discipline with the best track record, then its negation is endorsed by some competing discipline that you're trying to pit up against your discipline with the best track record. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I hope sort of there's a sort of more straightforward, intuitive picture that'll become clear as we proceed. So let's call TR belief functions belief functions that are such that if the discipline with the best track record in that possible world endorses P, then the belief function associated with P is higher than the value of the belief associated with P is higher than the belief associated with not P for all propositions in the opinion set. I left out the universal quantifier there, but it should be for all propositions in the opinion set. We can similarly characterize non-TR belief functions by just replacing TR with non-TR. And it's important to point out then that the non-TR belief functions are, they're not the complement of the TR belief functions. There'll be a whole bunch of belief functions that are neither TR nor non-TR. But the reason that I'm interested in just specifically TR versus non-TR is because I'm, recall the motivation right at the beginning. I'm interested in this deference claim, in this trumping claim. And so I'm always going to be in possession of two disciplines that are sort of going head to head. And so given that that's my starting point, it's enough for me to just consider these two extreme options, the TR belief functions and the non-TR belief functions. And so the fourth premise, the TR claim, is just that TR belief functions dominate non-TR belief functions. It's really that they immodestly Breer dominate them, but since I haven't introduced that, let's just go with the more general dominance claim. Right. So that's the claim. But of course, in order for this for the argument for DN to be sound, I'm going to have to give you some reason to believe that that claim is true. And so that's what I'm going to do in the next bit of this section. And the way that I'm going to argue for this is to make it clear that the track record argument actually has two components. And the way to see this is let's take whatever opinion set we've started off with and partition it into two classes. Choose some time t. Let that time t be the present moment in the rest frame of the agent that we care about, or something like that, right? Whatever it is that allows you to get a problem of induction type worry off the ground, and partition the set of the opinion set into propositions about the world before time t and propositions about the world after time t. With respect to that set F sub p, the track record observation, note that this is just an observation rather than the full-blown argument. The track record observation is just a matter of historical record. Just look at disciplines that have made various claims and look at the discipline that has the highest success about when it comes to true claims in that set P. The track record argument is then a meta-inductive claim, meta-inductive argument about the stuff in the other partition, which takes as an inductive base the propositions in F sub P. So let's look at the first part of the TR argument, the historical record, because it's actually, again, it's one of those things that's sort of intuitively plausible, but when you start trying to pin it down, it gets a bit sort of it's like trying to catch a bar of soap. So the question is, what is the historical record of scientific claims, right? Let's try to do this with respect to the actual world, right? So let's assume that science is the TR discipline in the actual world. That's a non-trivial assumption, but let's make that assumption for now. And let's ask the question, well, what is the historical record of scientific claims? And if you think about it, you'll realize that that's very much going to depend on what those propositions about the past are really about. In particular, when you talk about the success with respect to those propositions, are you talking about truth about observables? Are you talking about truth about unobservables? Are you talking about truths about some observables? And so you can ask the question, are scientific belief functions more accurate? Again, recall that we're now just in the actual world. So talks about accuracy are the special case of dominance claims, and talks about scientific belief functions are the sort of special case of TR functions. You can ask the question, are scientific belief functions closer to the omniscient belief function in the actual world than non-scientific ones, or than your favorite non-scientific ones? And I think plausibly the answer is yes. Again, this is non-trivial, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to say, at least when it comes to observables, the answer is yes. What about when it comes to unobservables? Well, that's going to depend. And it's going to depend quite strongly on what you think the propositions in FP are about. And so I think unproblematically, we can formulate what I'll call the weak TR argument, or sorry, the weak TR observation, which is recent science has been successful, that is to say, made true claims regarding observables, whereas time and again, non-scientific disciplines like philosophy have failed to be successful with respect to claims regarding observables. And so with respect to claims about observables, scientific disciplines have been more accurate than non-scientific ones. But I think that's far too weak for a sort of a good convincing deferential naturalism, because that makes deferential naturalism only available to a particularly austere brand of empiricist. And I'm not an austere empiricist, but I'd like to think that I'm a deferential naturalist. I'd like a version of DN that's available to people like me. So what can we do? Well, there was a reason that I chose to talk about science endorsing P in the way that I did. Right? Recall that I said science endorses P is equivalent to the claim that P can be inferred from some scientific tenets, some core scientific tenets, by some acceptable inference procedures. So now let's look at how we might actually argue that science endorses particular kinds of claims. Here's a thought. Science makes a whole bunch of really successful claims about observables. And as the success of science with respect to those observables grows, we might posit that this success is as a result of some kind of meta-scientific property. Let's just call it X. And so what we might posit is the idea that science has some property X, and it's in virtue of having this property X that it's successful when it comes to making claims about observables, right? So you get a conditional of the form XS arrow SS. And there are various candidates for that X. Here's one that's pretty I think at least intuitively plausible. Maybe not so much for everyone in this audience, but take a candidate to be the theoretical terms of science successfully refer. What we're then left with is an argument of this form, the conditional that we accepted. We've just got the observation that science is successful, and from that we conclude that science has the property X, that its theoretical terms refer. This would not get you any marks in a first-year logic exam because it's not deductively valid, but it's arguably abductively valid, right? It depends on sort of how strongly you can argue that this is an inference to the best explanation. And so if it's the case that inference to the best explanation is a legitimate form of inference, and that that premise one actually counts as a good explanation, then the success of science regarding observables will allow us to infer success regarding unobservables. But of course, everyone should be completely familiar with this argument. This is something we've seen a million times before. It's just sort of with a few sort of important differences. It's just a no miracles argument. It's just a second order inference to the best explanation. So we're very much in familiar realism versus anti-realism territory. And once we realize this, we realize that we can also then strengthen TR. So we can posit what I'll call realist TR, which is just recent science has been successful, that has made true claims with respect to observables in virtue of successful reference to theoretical terms, whereas time and again philosophy or non-scientific disciplines have failed to be, and so on and on and on. You can generate other TR versions of TR depending on what your scruples allow you to say about X. So if it's successful reference to modal terms or modal structure, that's presumably kosher for the ontic structural realist. Cognitively accessible structure would be kosher for some kind of structure, broadly speaking, some kind of structuralist, and so on and on. You can index it to your position on the spectrum. And what that's going to allow you to do is very straightforwardly characterize what the content of that set, that opinion set FP is. So that's the first part of TR, the TR observation side of things. What the TR observation says is going to depend very much on what you think about scientific realism versus anti-realism. The second part is fairly straightforward. The second part is just going to be about claims about the future. So the track record argument is meta-inductive. And so like any inductive argument, it's going to rely on some kind of regularity premise. And so let's just accept that. I don't want to have to argue that we can only get deferential naturalism off the ground if we've solved the problem of induction. I'm perfectly happy to grant a regularity thesis. And so if you grant a regularity thesis of the appropriate form, again, a lot of work is going to have to go into this, but I think it can be sort of precisely articulated. Then if we characterize the propositions about the future in the opinion set on the same basis with respect to your position on the realism anti-realism spectrum, then you've got your full-blown track record argument, your full-blown premise 4. So this is what the argument for deferential naturalism is going to look like. Well, not quite, right? Because if you look at the conclusion is not DN, as I'd stated it at the beginning. The conclusion is a more generic claim about the track record discipline in any possible world. To turn it into an argument for DN, we need to sort of split apart that fourth premise into more sub-premises. Premise 4A is just a claim about Breer dominance about, with respect to the past. 4b is just the regularity constraint or the regularity premise that I introduced. And 4c, which I think, again, as I said, is a highly non-trivial claim, is the claim that science is the TR discipline in the actual world. Once you've got all of that on the on the page, then you can conclude that it's epistemically irrational to choose any non-scientific belief function. And so this, I think, is a plausibly sound argument for deferential naturalism. And that's it. That's my suggestion for how you're going to solve the inference problem. That was really the core of the talk. One of the sort of very useful consequences of using epistemic utility theory in the way that I have is it also allows you to solve the parity and authority problems. So it's no surprise that I actually want to talk about those a little bit. So I'll talk about that for the last couple of minutes and then hopefully finish precisely on time. So how are we going to solve the parity and authority problem? Well, let me just remind you of what those problems were. The parity problem says, with respect to some epistemic goal, science trumps non-science, but why should we choose that goal? The authority problem is, why should we take the success of science as the basis for the kinds of dominance claims that we want to make? And I think it should be, it is fairly straightforward how we're going to deal with these two things. The parity problem is solved by whatever argument you had for choosing accuracy as the fundamental source of epistemic value. I didn't give you one in this talk, but I can sort of reliably assure you that there are plausible arguments for this. And so your resolution to the parity problem is going to very much depend on how plausible you think the justification for your choice of Veritism was. And given that we needed to establish that to just get off the ground that the argument was sound in the first place, once we've done that, we've solved the parity problem. Good. What about the authority problem? Well, we've seen that scientific endorsement comes in grades, and in particular, we can give Gideon Rosen the link that he's looking for by using pretty standard scientific realist toolkit sort of arguments, right? In particular, we can translate any argument for a particular brand of scientific realism into an argument for how that solves a particular version of the authority problem. And of course, it'll turn out that to the extent that you think that the authority problem is really a problem, you're going to have some solution on the basis of at least some vision of what an appropriate level of an appropriate level of commitment to scientific realism is. And so the scope of this of the trumping claim is just going to be indexed to the strength of one's realism. And once you do that, you're done. You've solved the authority problem. And that's really it. So let me briefly summarize what the whole talk was about. We started off with this worry that the conscientious undergraduate might have had, which is, and obviously sort of all of the rest of us as well. What do we do when science and philosophy conflict? Which one is the verb? What do we do when science and philosophy conflict and have a conflict? What we do, I want to argue, is that we defer to science for the reason that not deferring to science is irrational. Again, this seems like a plausible thing to argue, but again, cashing it out is fiddly. So the way that I chose to cash it out is via a violation of some dominance norm with respect to violation of some dominance norm with respect to an epistemic utility function. And so what that actually gave me was a kind of general argument that in whatever possible world you are, you should defer to, sorry, that's not quite true. In whatever possible world you are, that is regular in the appropriate way, you should defer to the discipline with the best track record with respect to propositions in the appropriate opinion set. But as with most of these things, I think the force of having an argument that's sort of sufficiently general across different possible worlds is really, it tells us, what we should do or what we should think about the actual world. And so it's really only the special case that I'm interested in. And so the special case of that general claim is that in the actual world, we should defer to science with respect to claims that conflict with non-scientific disciplines. And that's it. Thanks very much. This time I actually am done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tushar. That was really fascinating. So we'll take a 5-minute break. And so maybe regroup at 24 minutes past. If you, so the way we'll structure the Q&A is students get priority. If you do have a question, if you just type Q into the chat box and F for follow-up, I'll just systematically read through the questions and follow-ups. Feel free to do that now, or if you want to come back in 5 minutes. Yeah, well, I'll see. We'll regroup in 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'm going to get myself another cup of tea.